YouTube. This is just a general video, really. It's going to be one of those videos where I start talking at the camera and see what happens. Maybe nothing, I don't know. This may be just a rambling mess of a thing. But I was thinking recently about some stuff, about conversations that I've had with various Transformers fans and with other people as well. This is a topic that's very broad and relates to various different subjects and examples. But Transformers is quite a pertinent one, bizarrely. One of the things that I find fascinating about Transformers, and about a lot of toy franchises, but also created things, sort of characters and mythologies created by humanity, is the manner in which those things reflect humanity. We tend to anthropomorphize we know this is something that's utterly innate. Every human being does it. We project human characteristics onto inanimate objects. Thus we have things like ancient mythologies where we have personalizations of animals and of natural phenomena, things like the wind and lightning and rain and earth and earthquakes and so on and so forth. We anthropomorphize these things. We imbue them with sentience and narrative, and we make them reflections of ourselves. Very often, sadly, they sort of coalesce and congeal to the status of godhood, at which point they tend to become repositories for some that is good within us, some that is progressive and productive, but a lot which is negative and neurotic. This is certainly the case within the Abrahamic traditions in general. It seems to me the god of the Abrahamic tradition is generally a fairly neurotic entity. But with regards to Transformers, to which this is a related subject, we have exactly the same phenomena. We have these mechanical entities, these alien creatures, who are imbued with very human drives and characteristics. And what's particularly interesting about that is that there are portions of the fandom who find this very difficult to take. Very difficult to take. The notion that mechanical beings would react in human ways to particular stimuli. And this is perfectly understandable. I mean, if you look at the Transformers, they are ostensibly robots. It's not accurate to call them robots, interestingly. Despite the tagline, robots in disguise, it's not accurate to call them robots because they're not. They're depending on which mythology you come from. In some they are. For example, in the G1 cartoon, they are robots. They are products. They are machines. They're particularly advanced products that have developed sentience, that have developed something like consciousness. Independently, it seems, owing to their sophistication. They are products of an alien race called the Quintessons. And one group was made to be domestic and the other group was made to be military hardware, so you have the Autobots and the Decepticons. I like this mythology because I find it particularly interesting. Other mythologies have gone down a more sort of Abrahamic route. You have like creation myths where or you even have notions of a technogenesis, which is the notion that the Transformers are actually naturally occurring creatures. They have evolved in the same way that biological life has evolved. The only difference is the materials. And this I find particularly fascinating. The notion that you can have life and sentience and consciousness evolved from entirely different materials within different contexts. Now the question there is, well, there are lots of questions. It's a very difficult thing. How do you define consciousness, for one thing? What is the phenomena of consciousness and how do you recognize it? Obviously, the Transformers demonstrate it in the same way that the gods of ancient mythology do. They have this concept of I am. I acknowledge my own existence, and I can conduct myself on the basis of that acknowledgement. This is a very, very basic definition of what consciousness is. And in that regard, they not only act as reflections of human consciousness, they are means by which the phenomena of consciousness can be explored. Now, what's interesting about the development of human personality and consciousness is that much of what makes us different derives from flaws in our biology, it seems. It's mutations and variations that determine our differences, not to mention the influences that feed into the development of our consciousness from when we are born. Thus, we have neuroses that inform our personalities. We have these various obsessions and imperfections and interests and drives and dreads and so on and so forth. Each human being, therefore, becomes a kind of experience in and of itself. It becomes a universe in and of itself, not just a consciousness, but a universe in and of itself. The reality in which that human operates is different in fundamental ways from the reality in which every other human operates, because the consciousness is different. The phenomena that we call consciousness is developed in a different way. And it's problematic. It's very problematic because it means we can't really find a proper or working definition of what consciousness is. We can't even separate it from notions of reality, because consciousness is the very definition of reality. It's not only the medium through which we primarily experience or exclusively experience reality, it is the definition of reality. You remove consciousness, you have no reality. It's as simple as that. However, this is interesting when you translate it over to a sort of transhumanist arena, where you have creatures or entities that do not have biology. Instead, they have machinery. The Transformers are a good example. The Terminator is another good example. Cyborgs, any sort of robot or cyborg or artificial entity is a good example. Another very pertinent example are virtual creatures, virtual intelligences, creatures that are either deliberately created to emulate or to have consciousness. And there's a problem as well. There's a massive problem we have with the definition of consciousness. When you have an entity that can emulate consciousness to the degree whereby it is indistinguishable from what we call a conscious creature, then the definition between the emulation of consciousness and actual consciousness, which is a flawed notion in of itself, just dissolves. So the emulation and what we call the definite article, for whatever reason, becomes meaningless. And this is what we have with the Transformers and with other robots and cyborgs and things as well. We have this problem where consciousness and its requirements are so ill-defined that there seems to be very little parameter for it. There seems to be no way of objectively exploring it. The reason being that we cannot objectively view consciousness. It's not possible. We cannot sort of separate that thing, that phenomena that we call consciousness from our minds, put it there, and then say, yes, there's the mechanisms that inform this thing. Here's the influences that caused that particular part of it to develop. It doesn't work that way, because we are our consciousnesses, and our realities are our consciousnesses to a very certain degree. This is not to say that there is or may not be some form of objective reality in which we play. There very well may be, and there is a kind of arena there. We can determine that ourselves, but that's really not the issue. Whether there's an objective reality or not outside of consciousness is not the issue. The very fact that if there is that thing, we experience it exclusively via the filter of our individual consciousnesses that are unique in every single head, in every single human head. There is a unique phenomena of consciousness, which is determined by so many different variables. That's kind of the point. It makes every human being a species in and of themselves, and I don't see why. I know a lot of people have a problem with this, but I don't see why entities like the Transformers, for example, who, regardless of where they come from, whether they're created or whether they are evolved or whatever, I don't see why, if the materials, the mechanisms are sufficiently complex that inform them, why their consciousnesses, their experience of consciousness wouldn't also be equally various, equally flawed, equally difficult to define. It would mean that if they are indeed an evolving race, and they evidently are, I mean, they're very much an evolving race, they not only alter their perceptions in the same way that we do in response to experience, but they also alter their physicalities, they alter their bodies, they constantly refine and develop in response to environment and external pressures, and very quickly as well. They don't evolve in the same way that we do. They evolve very quickly within not within generations, although they do evolve over generations. They evolve themselves. Individuals evolve quickly and develop various new advantages and disadvantages and mutations and new mechanisms and even entirely new body forms. So I don't see why the Transformers are any kind of example of a sort of mechanical or pseudo-mechanical entity, or rather semi-mechanical entity, wouldn't also have quirks and neuroses and incredible variations of perception and experience, depending on the complexity of the mechanisms that they are composed of, and also the nature of those mechanisms. If those mechanisms are indeed self-improving or rather mutational, if they are transformative in the same way that our biology is, then it doesn't matter, does it? I mean, the difference between one being mechanical and one being biological is completely incidental. All that matters is the phenomena of consciousness, and that is a better way of thinking about it, it seems to me. It really does. If an entity is able to say "I am" and to demonstrate that it acknowledges it and can express its own existence, then it has a kind of consciousness. Whether it is artificial or not, it really doesn't matter, or whether it's ostensibly an emulation of consciousness, because we have no means of defining whether it is an emulation or not, or even what we consider the definite article is. We have a real philosophical and scientific problem there, which I think probably won't ever be completely defined or mapped out. I think it is one of those areas where we have to acknowledge we are going to operate within uncertainty, because we're dealing with a phenomena that is part abstraction. It's part ideas and perceptions and experience, and sort of biological and physical exploration doesn't go there. It can explore the roots of the phenomena, of the sort of chemical phenomena that result in those things, but it can't explore those things in and of themselves. Biological exploration of the brain, for example, or biochemical exploration of the brain, tells us nothing about the experiential. It tells us what parts of the brain are turned on by particular stimuli, or what parts of the brain change in response to particular stimuli. But what it does not tell you anything about is how that individual, the consciousness housed within that brain, is experiencing those things. That's the arena of philosophy, that's the arena of abstraction and poetry and art and so on and so forth. And in that regard, since the Transformers are a race that have evolved or have been programmed with a condition whereby they are able to operate within the abstract in the same way that we are, the phenomena of consciousness and the foibles that go with it, the various imperfections, the variations in personality, the bizarre quirks that seem very, very human, are not that difficult to take when you think about it. They are not that difficult to take. They make more sense in a bizarre kind of way, especially if you consider them to be products of another species rather than evolved in their own particular way or created by a god or whatever. If you take the excuse me, if you take the G1 cartoon mythology as gospel, it makes a lot of sense, since they will inevitably be programmed with or rather, they will inevitably be reflections of whatever species created them to a certain degree, or the species they are created to serve. So yeah, it's interesting. It's the kind of thing that a lot of science fiction authors go into a lot. I mean, you have it in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, or Blade Runner, which is the film adaptation. Is probably one of the most seminal explorations of this, which is at what point do we stop thinking of an artificial intelligence or an artificial consciousness as a product, and at what point do we start considering it to just be another form of consciousness that just happens to be sustained by different materials, or which has a slightly different origin to what we would recognize as consciousness, because it wasn't born or evolved or whatever. It's interesting. It's an absolutely fascinating part of science fiction and transhumanism and philosophy and just general science. I find it absolutely fascinating. So yeah, and what I love is the fact that you can have these conversations about something like Transformers. You can have these conversations about anything. That's what people tend to miss. You can have these conversations about material that people would consider to be low, or to be aimed at the lowest common denominator, or childish, or whatever. Superhero comic books, Transformers, toy franchise, mythologies, or whatever. You could make these things an example, or use them as the basis for actual philosophical exploration, and that's what I find absolutely fascinating. Because they are reflections of humanity in the same way that gods are, in the same way that demons are, in the same way that angels are, in the same way that any created mythological entity is. They are very much postmodern reflections of exactly that phenomena. The superheroes are particularly pertinent in this, because the superheroes have their roots in in ancient Greek and Celtic, Nordic mythology. Some of them very literally. I mean, Thor obviously is taken directly from Nordic mythology. But the reason Thor and his ilk fit in so well into the Marvel Universe, and they do, is because the characters within the Marvel Universe and the DC Universe are just postmodern reflections of the same concerns and of the same ideas. Superman is... in the DC universe, Superman is a very particular heroic archetype. There's a little bit of Christ in him. There's a little bit of Hercules there. There's a lot of different concepts and archetypes bound up into him, which have echoes throughout mythological history. Everything is tied together. There's no such thing as a created thing that exists in isolation, just as there's no such thing as a cultural concept that exists in isolation. Every single thing is part of a continuum of, or rather part of an ever elaborating web of probabilities related to what has gone before and what could potentially come after, or what could potentially have gone before. It's absolutely fascinating, this whole phenomena, and this is spiraling out of all control now. If I carry on, this will go into realms of utter and absolute abstraction, which I probably won't be able to control or comprehend. So I'm going to sign off now. Now I've stopped rambling at the camera for God knows how long. Anyway, I hope this was interesting or enlightening, and I'd love to hear some... By the way, I do have a vid response here on my computer to Lee, to Damn You Husses, who did a really interesting video about whether characters within the Transformers universe should remain, whether those characters that exist exclusively within the mythology, within media, within comic books and whatnot, and were created for those mythologies, should remain abstract rather than having toys made of them. I find that was really fascinating. I do have a video response here, Lee, but every time I've tried to upload it, it's crashed my computer. I'm going to give it another go and see what happens, but hopefully I'll have that uploaded reasonably soon. Many thanks for watching, and I hope this was interesting. And thank you again to everyone who subscribes to me and watches my videos. Yeah, bye bye.